Good evening, shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to Un-Apologetics. We are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. And before we get started here, I would just like to say a brief prayer if you would like to join me. Heavenly Father, I just thank you for everything that you have blessed us with here, Lord, and I thank you for, thank you for allowing us the opportunity to read and to study your word, Lord. I pray that your blessings be upon everybody watching this video and not, Lord, and that you touch their hearts in every way, and that you guide me to only speak the truth in your will, Lord, and your will be done. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen. Alrighty. So, I actually have a few things to say here. First and foremost, I said last episode that we were going to be talking about Isaiah. And at the time that was actually the plan. However, I've decided since we were talking about Daniel 2, might as well just continue on with some Daniel prophecies. And this is in no particular order as far as number of chapters, but basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Daniel 11 today. My next episode, I think we're going to do Daniel 8 or 9. 7 is kind of a repeat of 2, so that'll be a little bit easy. We'll actually probably be able to squeeze that into maybe even something a little bit shorter than the rest of them. And then also we want to get into Daniel 12 a little bit. And then once we have actually completed all the different prophecies of Daniel, that's when we're actually going to move on to the prophecies of Isaiah. That way we're just, finishing each prophet as we go on. Now, I want to first and foremost state here that a lot of the information that I have here is via a biblical teacher and pastor by the name of Bruce Gore. Now, that is not to say that all of this is coming from him, of course, but just so you guys know, that is my primary source for a lot of this information. I do have some other sources here, and of course, per usual, we'll have them in the description there. But the main source where we're getting this information, other than the Bible itself, of course, is Pastor Gore, and I will have a link to some of his videos in the description here so that you guys can actually check that out. Also, lastly, I would also just like to say, again, gracenampa.org for any of you guys who are interested in listening to some church services. It's GRACE, word grace, and then Nampa, NAMPA, no spaces, .org. And it is a absolutely phenomenal church service, so I definitely do recommend that you check it out. Now let's go ahead and get started to this. If any of you guys do want to read along with me, then you certainly can. But this is the Daniel 11 prophecy, and I will be reading out of the King James Version of the Bible here on my phone. Starting with chapter 1, we're going to read through the whole chapter. So, also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood to confirm and to strengthen him. Real quick, just want to briefly state for you guys, there is considerable controversy about who Darius the Mede is. That is not the point of this video, so this is going to be my only addressing of that in this video, and we'll be doing a video on that at a later time, but that is just something that should be established here for you. It is whoever Darius the Mede is. He is either one of Cyrus's generals, Cyrus himself, or some unknown to modern scholars king in between Cyrus and Belshazzar of Babylon. So just to inform you guys on that real quick. Right, and starting now again with verse number 2. And now will I shew thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. Alright. Now, if we do actually go through here, we do see there are so it says stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, which, by the way, just towards that one leads me to believe that Darius is Cyrus, but nonetheless. So after these, you do actually end up having 3 kings here. You have Cambyses, then here, let me just pick up my notes here. You have Cambyses the second. Okay, so Cyrus the Great is the founder of the Persian Empire, right? The Medo-Persian Empire, and he does all of his conquering between about 551 and 339, roughly. Well, sort of, because he does actually end up conquering some territory a little bit farther down. He himself actually isn't able to get to Egypt, though it is this Cambyses II. Now, Cambyses is interesting historically for a few reasons. Namely, he, like I said, is the conqueror of Egypt. He also was very big on trying to ensure that the Jews did not get the temple that they were trying to rebuild, that of course Cyrus said they could rebuild. And he ruled from about 530 to 522 BC after Cyrus had died in 530 BC. It was 559 to 530 BC that Cyrus himself was actually reigning over the Persian Empire after all his great conquests. So that's the first of these three more kings, is Cambyses II. During his, just an interesting fun fact for you, during his conquest of Egypt, he actually, number one, according to the legend, had cats and other animals painted on his shield, strapped on his shield, and running around his army in order to make sure that the Egyptians wouldn't attack him, because they had a religious reverence for animals. And then he also slew the Opus bull when he got to Egypt. So he was particularly disliked and hated by the what are they called? Egyptians. My apologies. By the Egyptians. They did not like him, and as a result, they also did not like the Persians due to this conquest, right? And of course, he rules after Cyrus the Great, who again does 559 to 530. You can say 551, 550-ish if you like, as far as emperor is concerned, because that is when he united the Persians and the Medes. However, that is not the point of this particular discussion. Now, our next ruler, the second king after Cambyses II, is Pseudo-Smerdis. Now, Pseudo-Smerdis is also known as Gamada. He wasn't actually supposed to be there. He basically assassinated Cambyses and usurped the throne. And he actually wasn't there for a long time at all. He actually was there for about a month or so, only in 522 BC. And then after him, he ended up having a reign that was pretty well uneventful, to be honest with you. He did want to reinstate the Magi form of worship, but again, he was only really in power for a very short amount of time, and so that didn't end up actually coming to pass, nor did really any of the fruits of his labors come to pass very much. And then the next one is Darius II. A lot of people call him Darius the Great. Darius II starts ruling in about 522 to 486, and this, of course, is all BC. During his reign, he is actually known as a very friendly king to the Jews. He actually reinstates that they can, he reinstates that they can go build their temple and all of that good stuff. He is also the king who actually first attacks Greece in the Battle of Marathon, you might remember, 490 BC. And so there you have the three kings that rise in Persia. And the fourth after them is Xerxes. And it says here, Xerxes shall be richer than them all, and by his strength through his riches he shall stir up against the realm of Gracia. And of course, this is entirely accurate. Xerxes was easily the richest king, not due to himself, of course. It was actually due to the rulers who came before him, the brilliance of Cyrus and Darius in particular. Xerxes himself was actually kind of just terrible ruler, to be entirely honest with you. He was a terrible tactician, he was a terrible ruler. His invasion of Greece was terrible. He was kind of insane. As an example, when he lost at the Battle of Sardis during the invasion of Greece, he actually took off his belt, according to legend, and started to strike the water, right, because it had taken out his boats. Now, that is, that's particularly strange behavior, to think that you can actually go out and strike the ocean and do something to it, you know what I mean? And you could say he might have just been doing it in a fit of rage, but the way it is actually described by the ancient sources, it is kind of along the lines of a fit of psychotic rage, right? And he has other stories, like he's believed to be Esther's wife in the book of Esther, and the beginning of that book actually has him take his wife out so that all may marvel at her beauty, and there's no real indication of what exactly that means, considering that the Greeks talked a lot about the indulgences of the Persians. It could very well have been a sort of like a sexual thing. We don't really know that for a fact, but it's possible. Nonetheless, he just did a lot of things that you wouldn't think of somebody who was necessarily all they're doing. He was a little unpredictable as well, but he was richer than them all. And due to all of the great rulership and conquest of the people around him and the people who were before him, he had a lot of money and a whole lot of soldiers. And he actually decided that he was going to take all of his soldiers. It's been said that it was anywhere from 300,000 to 1 million that Herodotus gave. Some people give numbers as low as 100,000, but I personally doubt that they were that small. Nonetheless, he sends this massive invasion in retaliation for Darius's loss at the Battle of Marathon. And he does so with all of his riches and all of his money, of course, right? Because he's the richest king that Persia will ever have. And he establishes an incursion into Europe, and most of the European, or specifically Greek city-states, actually just allow him to pass through without a fight. They'll give tribute to him. They don't want to be held accountable, so to speak, to the Persian sword, right? So they decide that they're just going to play along, with the exception of Sparta and Athens. Sparta and Athens decide they are definitely not going to play along. They're going to fight, and fight they do. And so they decide they're going to take two big positions, right? They have Thermopylae, and then on top of Thermopylae, they also have I just said this. It's the Hot Gates. It's the Battle of the Hot Gates. Nonetheless, it'll come to me eventually. But nonetheless, the point being that at this battle, right, both of these battles they technically lost. However, the battles were very much Pyrrhic victories, and the Persian forces ended up being severely weakened by the two battles. And then eventually, once they all meet up in a third incursion, whose name I also can't remember at this point. I'm sorry, I should have wrote that kind of stuff down. I was more involved with the history of the prophecy more than the history of that particular invasion. But nonetheless, the invasion does actually fail. And it fails quite miserably, actually. It's one of those things where you had an insane numerical advantage. You could have landed pretty much anywhere else, and you decided to land in a place like Thermopylae, right? It was just absolutely terrible. But nonetheless, Xerxes, does lead this invasion, as is told here in the prophecy. Verse number 3, "And a mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." Now, this is coming directly after verse number 2, of course, when he says he stirs up all against the realm of Thracia. And then it says, "And a mighty king shall stand up." Now, notice it doesn't say that this is the fifth king. It says specifically that a mighty king raises up after it says that there is an invasion into Greece, and it also leaves out any possibility of this being the fifth king. So that tells us a few things. Number one, that it's later down the road, and number two, that it's not a Persian king. And considering that he is rising up out of a result of verse number 2, right? Verse number 2 is coming out of, or verse number 3 is coming out of verse number 2. It is assumed that this is a Greek, right? And of course, Alexander the Great, 336 to 322 BC. He begins to reign. He is the one who gives us the Hellenistic age and the Greek age and the Greek language, which the New Testament, a lot of it is actually written in. He had brilliant, absolutely brilliant, utterly ruthless, of course, but absolutely brilliant military strategy and battle in his conquest of Persia. He actually ended up getting Persia thoroughly conquered by about 330, 6 years into his rule. By 325, he actually had gone so far as to incur into India from Greece, right? He's just going and going and going and going and going. And there was even a legend that said that when he was 29, he fell on his face and wept because there was no more worlds left to conquer. Of course, that we know that that's not true, because he was actually preparing for another invasion into a as yet unspecified territory at the time of his death. It was either going to be into Kushite territory, which would be modern-day Sudan, Ethiopia, into the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, and all that area, right? Modern Saudi Arabia, of course. Or into Rome, and possibly also into Libya. So he was even actively planning other invasions. But nonetheless, it just goes to show how much respect people had for what he did, right? And it, of course, as it says that he will do according to his will, and of course he definitely does. He goes around and does pretty much anything that he wants to, because he is Alexander the Great, right? Alexandrius Magnus. And there's just no one who can actually surpass his military might at this time, nor is there anyone who could surpass the military might of the Macedonian Greek Empire at this time. Mainly due to the advent of the phalanx. It was a very brilliant strategy, but also due to the fact that Alexander himself was brilliant. He had his father's ideas of cavalry, which ended up actually being some of the greatest ideas in the history of cavalry warfare, and Alexander expanded on them. Again, this isn't supposed to go into the specific history of each individual thing, but just to let you know what actually happened. It is quite impressive, though. I would recommend watching documentaries on specifically actually the Battle of the Gracious River. I actually love that. He actually ends up saying, so the battle plan, the generals, long story short, the generals didn't end up liking the battle plan that they had, and so they said, there's just absolutely no way we can win. To which Alexander replied, yeah, but if we do, think of the glory. And I think that was just absolutely hilarious, because it goes to Alexander the Great's character very, very severely. Nonetheless, moving on. Verse number 4. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those. Right, and of course, this is reference to right after Alexander dies, he actually ends up having his kingdom destroyed. Now, his one and only son, right, who would be his quote-unquote legitimate heir, Alexander IV, excuse me. A little known fact for you, Alexander is actually Alexander III of Macedon, so his son was Alexander IV, but Alexander IV was actually born mere months before his father died. So he is just a little itty-bitty baby, right? And what is his name? Shoot. It wasn't Aristotle, it was his other mentor, but it was, that actually is irritating me. My apologies, I am forgetting way too much stuff right now. Nonetheless, so he ends up telling one of his advisors who comes up to him, hey, the advisor asks, where or what exactly are we to do with this kingdom? Who's going to be the next king? Alexander's reply is, let it be the strongest. And that ends up causing about 22 years of solid civil war between the empire. It initially splits into 4. Now, eventually the 4 is actually whittled down to about 3. And other kingdoms, mainly the Greco-Indian kingdoms, also rise after. But initially, the split is into 4. And it's 4 different generals who the split actually goes, who become the kings of the 4 areas. In Macedon, Cassander becomes the king. In Asia Minor, Antigonus becomes the king, and he becomes the king in Asia Minor roughly 315 BC. And he doesn't last very long, too. He actually ends up, well, actually, we'll go ahead and get to, well, actually, no. So he gets it in 315 BC is when he attacks Ptolemy. But nonetheless, we will get to that. Seleucus in Syria, and then Ptolemy in Egypt. Now, the interesting thing about it here is that, first off, it makes the point that it will not go to his posterity. A lot of people actually don't even know that Alexander the Great had a child, but indeed he did. Now, if I said that, I have these new tires for you, but we're not going to put them on your Corvette, and you don't have a Corvette, then you will inevitably reply with, but I don't have a Corvette. So, it is just interesting there that it has an implication of Alexander's little-known son, right? It's not saying because he has no posterity, it's just saying it's not going to go to his posterity, right? And neither according to his dominion, right? So his dynasty, his people don't end up ruling over it. Cassander is, to the best of my knowledge, a Greek, not a Macedonian. But he ends up ruling Macedon and the Greek peninsula. And like I said, Antigonus takes Asia Minor. Seleucus actually is a subordinate to Ptolemy at first. And somewhere along the lines, it's never really clearly stated when, but it's roughly around the time that Antigonus attacks Seleucus in 315 BC. Antigonus starts to become more and more of his own emperor, right? And he actually places his capital in Babylon, whereas Ptolemy styles himself as the pharaoh of Egypt. And it is interesting that they are divided into 4, precisely as the verse is indicating. And the king of the south, which of course the southernmost point here would definitely be Ptolemy. King of the south shall be strong, one of his princes and he shall be strong above him. Sorry, I read that wrong. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Right? And some other translations say that he shall rule a realm greater than his own realm. Right? Either way, it is actually still accurate in that Seleucus is not only a commander, he's an officer under Ptolemy during the time that Alexander is actually around, and even also a contemporary of Alexander. Seleucus is also a prince under Ptolemy at first, right? And when he makes his incursion into Syria, if you read the ancient sources, it's a little bit ambiguous as to whether or not he is taking this for himself, but the implication is that Ptolemy sent him up there, which implies that he is in fact under the command of Ptolemy. And again, it's not until about 315-ish BC, when Antigonus actually attacks Seleucus, that Seleucus starts to act like his own ruler, right? That he is big britches in Syria, so to speak. And of course, if you do look at Seleucus's realm is greater than the other three combined, plus the Greco-Roman state, or not the Greco-Roman, sorry, the Greco-Indian states. He ends up getting a absolutely massive realm in the Seleucid Empire that ends up stretching from the Hindu Kush Mountains all the way to the Mediterranean, with, give or take, sometimes losing the Holy Land of Israel to the Ptolemaics. At first, the Ptolemaics actually do possess the land of Israel, I believe. I might be wrong about that, actually. Nonetheless, so moving on to verse number 6. Also, just so you know, Alexander IV, roughly uneventful. He dies at the age of 14 in about 309 BC. Not a whole lot to be said about him. He ends up inheriting virtually nothing. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm. But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. And again, this is verse number 6. And so what ends up happening here, and it is interesting, of course, because we're getting a lot of details here from Daniel, and keep in mind that this is the second year of Darius the Mede. If Darius the Mede is the same person as Cyrus the Great, then this is 538 BC or 539 BC that this is being given. And the time that this is being written, provided that this was written by Daniel, which of course I believe it is, then it would be roughly 530-ish BC, right? And so he's putting a lot of detail into this future here. And likewise, we can actually verify those details as coming true. So we have Ptolemy II. Now the interesting thing about the Ptolemies, quickly, is that it is Ptolemy and the number after. Every single Ptolemy, every single king, or pharaoh rather, in the Ptolemaic dynasty is Ptolemy, insert regnal number. There's 13 of them to be precise. They do the same thing with Cleopatra's. There's 7 total Cleopatras. The 14th pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty is the last. She is the famous Cleopatra, Cleopatra VII. Nonetheless, Ptolemy II Philadelphos, which actually means a lover of a brother, he comes to power in about 285 and rules until about 246 BC. Right, his father Ptolemy I ruled from 322 to 285, and Ptolemy II is now ruling from 285 to 246. Now, Ptolemy II has a sister by the name of Berenice, or not has a sister, rather has a son. It's not even a son. Daughter. By the name of Berenice. And Berenice actually sends to get married to Antiochus II, right? Because Antiochus I, Soter, rules from about 289 to 261. It does take quite a while, but finally there is peace after the First Syrian War and the Second Syrian War, which is 2 consecutive attacks. The First Syrian War I have written down here, it's 260 to 258, or 248 rather. The peace is technically started in about 253, but the treaty itself isn't actually signed until 248. Did I end up writing down for the first? Yes, I didn't write down the First Syrian War. Now, interestingly enough, these guys, like we said, actually start off as friends, to the point where Antigonus actually, in 315, when he made his incursion into Seleucus' territory, Seleucus is losing, and Ptolemy actually comes to back him up in about 312. And then, of course, at that point, Seleucus gets the majority of Asia Minor under his control. Now we get to this point, and from about 274 to 271, you have Antiochus the First Soter actually attacks Ptolemy II. And so I did write it down here, and that's the First Syrian War. And then you have the Second Syrian War. There's 6, by the way. The Second Syrian War here from 268 to 248. And finally, when Berenice is sent to Antiochus II, because in 261, Antiochus the First Soter ends up dying, and Antiochus the Second Theos, 261 to 246, ends up ruling. Now, you're probably wondering what these titles afterwards are. They like to give themselves real grandiose titles. I can't remember what Soter means. Theos means God. So you can obviously see what that man thought of himself. Quite the ego, right? But nonetheless, Berenice goes to marry him. However, he already has a wife by the name of Laodice. You may know the name Laodicea for the city Laodicea, as well as the church age Laodicea, if you know the church age theory, as well as the church talked about in the book of Revelation, Laodicea, right? Well, she's actually the namesake, right, Laodice. And she is already Antiochus II's wife, so she, of course, does not approve of this new marriage to Berenice. So she actually poisons Antiochus II, Berenice, and their son. Poisons all of them, and of course, this means the deal is off, and the Ptolemies aren't very happy. Right? They're definitely wanting to go back to war, and this is something that is spoken of here in verse number 7. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come up with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Right? And we see this happen. The king of the south here, Ptolemy III Euergetes, means the doer of good works. I believe that one means the doer of good works. I'm not too great on the Greek, unfortunately. But he begins his rule in about 246 and rules from 246 to 222. And he comes out to, and he, of course, out of a branch from her roots, he's a brother, and he is not happy at all. So in order to avenge Berenice's death in about 246, as soon as he starts to reign, he launches the Third Syrian War, which lasts 246 to 241. And Seleucus II, Canonicus, who starts to reign from 246 to 226 BC, is the king of the north at this time, which would be the king of the Seleucid Empire. Right, so we get this war launched up, and it actually goes smashingly well at first for Ptolemy III. And not even really just at first, it ends up actually just being a really phenomenal fight for him. He ends up, and of course, verse number 8 even goes on to explain what ends up happening, but if you look at your history books, this is precisely what does end up happening. And shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes and with their precious vessels and silver, and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Now it's interesting here, so now we no longer have to speculate, and now has told us the king of the south is in Egypt. But also, it is interesting here, it gives another prophecy within that prophecy, and of course this is a multifaceted prophecy, very detailed, where it says that Ptolemy is actually going to live longer, and Ptolemy dies in about 222 BC, whereas Seleucus II dies in about 226. Right, so he outlives him by about 4 years, despite the fact that they start ruling around the same time, which is 246. And Seleucus II, of course, ends up taking control because of the fact that Antiochus II was murdered. Now, after this, you get to... one second. Sorry, excuse me about that. Get to Daniel 9, says, so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. 240, Seleucus attempts but fails to counter-invade. Right, that is the end of the Third Syrian War. Verse number 10, but his sons shall be stirred up. Notice it says sons, plural. And shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow, and pass through, then shall he return, and be stirred up, even to his fortress. So, this man is Ptolemy IV Philopator, which means lover of my father. 222 to 205 BC is his reign. Now, Seleucus III Serenus is assassinated. I don't actually, for whatever reason, have his rule written down here, but it's 226 to 223 nonetheless. Excuse me. And he is assassinated, and who comes to power is Antiochus III, also known as Antiochus III Magnus or Antiochus III the Great, depending on your particular variation. And now the first king we have here, Seleucus III, right before he's assassinated, he is launching the Fourth Syrian War. Then the sorry, I am just really spacey sometimes. Then he is assassinated, Antiochus III comes to power, and he continues this war, right? And the war ends up ending in about 216. The final battle of it is the Battle of Raphia. Ptolemy actually wins the Battle of Raphia, and so there is peace in about, well, technically there is peace. The real peace doesn't come until about 211 BC, to be honest with you. And it's the weird thing with treaties and skirmishes and different incursions. But the Battle of Raphia is really the decisive last battle in 217 BC, and that's what decides that the war is pretty much over. Verse 11 goes on to say, "And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north, and he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given unto his hand." Right? So it just goes to say here that he will be fighting with them, and of course he's going to end up losing. And we see that happening in the record of the prophets here, as has already been. I guess I probably should have saved that explanation for after the verse. It's a little out of sync. But nonetheless, verse number 12. "And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it." And what this is, and this is about 211 BC, Ptolemy, which Ptolemy is this? Ptolemy the Fourth begins persecuting the Jewish people. So far, the Jews have actually not been persecuted by anyone on the Greek side. So this is a little strange for them. They actually grow to resent Ptolemy quite a bit. And this is what it means when it says that he is going to cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. In fact, he even is weakened by it, as this ends up, basically a lot of the Jews end up calling for the king of the south to come in, the king of the north rather, in the Seleucids to come in, and they're very welcoming of the Seleucids when they do eventually come in. Verse number 13, "For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and much riches." So we see here that from 211 to 205 BC, Antiochus builds up a massive army in the eastern part of his empire. Verse number 14 goes on to say that in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but shall fall rather. Now there's a few things here that we want to note. The first thing here is mainly the vision that these people are trying to fulfill. You see in 211 BC some Messianic rebellions by the Jewish people, right? Some Jewish people start claiming they are the Messiah, and you see rebellions as a result of these people thinking that these other people are the Messiah. One famous such example is the founder of the Essenes, named the Teacher of Righteousness. Another famous example is Judas, the priest Judas. I can't remember. He had a title after it. But nonetheless, you have Messianic rebellions against Ptolemy, and Ptolemy is very severe in the punishment. And so when the people here try to overthrow Ptolemy in Israel and establish a Messianic kingdom, they fail severely. But they do weaken the Ptolemaic Empire a lot, which allows the Seleucids to have quite the incursion once they finally do attack in the Fifth Syrian War. On to verse number 15. "So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand." And you see this in Antiochus III. The reason he's called the Great is because of his smashing victories against the Ptolemaics. The Fifth Syrian War from 202 to 199, the south takes Judah, the south takes Paneas fort, the south takes Syria. The south is just doing absolutely phenomenal. Or not the south, actually, it's interesting here. I do have it written as the south, but it is the north. I don't understand why I wrote it down as the south. My apologies. The north, the Seleucids, are the ones who are leading this attack. And it's just absolutely smashing victory after absolutely smashing victory. It takes only 3 years for them to get this mass incursion, taking all of that land and basically delegating the Ptolemaic dynasty to Africa and Africa only. Ptolemy V Epiphanes is the king during this time. He's actually 8 years old when he becomes king. He rules from 205 to 180 BC. Epiphanes is a title we will see come up again, but for a Seleucid ruler. Epiphanes actually means God manifest. So, again, you can see the absolutely incredible ego of these rulers. And the next Epiphanes, there's a play on words there that the Jews use on his name, but we won't go to that until we actually cover him. Nonetheless, let's move on here to Daniel chapter 11, verse number 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land which by his hand shall be consumed. Which, of course, this is reference to the fact that during this war he takes Israel, and of course he does. It's actually due to this taking of Israel that the next Epiphanes that we're going to get into ends up being important at all. Verse number 17. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, and he shall not stand on his side, neither before him. Right? So, basically, what ends up happening here is he's trying to get a peace treaty by virtue of marriage of his daughter to this young, impressionable king, and this young daughter actually recognizes that, and this is Cleopatra the First, by the way, so this is the first of 7 Cleopatras, the last of which is the famous Cleopatra the Seventh, and final pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty and of Egypt in general. And his idea is that Antiochus III's idea is that if he can get Cleopatra married to this young Ptolemy, he can get her to basically gear this young, very impressionable Ptolemy under the wing of Antiochus himself, thus making him essentially a client of Antiochus. Cleopatra the First, however, is pretty sharp herself, and she recognizes that the Seleucids are pretty much nothing comparatively to the rising power of Rome. So she actually decides, after this peace treaty of marriage in 197 BC, that she's going to tell Ptolemy, you need to ally with the Romans, not with Antiochus III and not with the Seleucids, because the Romans are where it's at. Bet on Rome, do not bet on Syria. The Romans are going to be incredibly powerful. Of course, at this point, the Romans just freshly defeated Carthage, so that's probably fresh in her mind. And actually, this is just something that Antiochus III is absolutely infuriated over. He is just so angry, and he ends up making some pretty ridiculous decisions as a result of that, which we'll get into in just a moment. But real quick, I just want to say the Rosetta Stone, actually, the famous stone, it's famous because it allowed us to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs, at least partially, because it has Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. Hieroglyphic is, of course, Egyptian. Demotic is Egyptian in a phonetic alphabet, and Greek is, of course, Greek. So that allowed us to translate it to Greek, and as a result of translating it to Greek, we can translate it from Greek to English. And that is why, even though it is a limited understanding, why we do have at least somewhat of an understanding of the Egyptian language. Well, fun fact, this Egyptian Rosetta Stone is actually celebrating the marriage 197 BC between Cleopatra I and this Ptolemy character. Again, this is Ptolemy. I believe this is the 6th now that we're on. 5th. My apologies. Anyways, so then on to Daniel 11:18. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease, Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. So what we have here is that Antiochus tries to reassert his dominance over Asia Minor, go after the isles off of the coast of Asia Minor, to overthrow the power of Rome there, and he also tries to overthrow the power of Rome in Greece, and this is from 196 BC to 192. And of course, the idea is that he wants to prove to his daughter that she's making the wrong decision, right? That essentially that she is wrong, that she should not have betrayed him like this, and that he himself is more powerful than Rome. Daniel 11:19 shows that this actually does not work at all. And of course history shows this as well. In 11:19 it says, "Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found." And this is actually known in 188 BC as the Peace of Apamea, because in 188 BC is when he gets these incredibly harsh terms levied against him. This Antiochus III does. And essentially the Romans just absolutely humiliate him. You know what I mean? He actually, as a result of this, goes to try and rob a temple in Susa, which is a Persian holy city for both the Magi and Zoroasters, and he is murdered while he is trying to rob the temple there in Susa so that he can pay his tribute to Rome. And it's actually, so it is rather stark, though, how you can see just the political detail that Daniel is able to prophesy so many hundreds of years before the fact. Like I said, this was written in about 530 BC. Daniel 11:20, "Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle." So the person you have here is Heliodorus, and Heliodorus is actually risen up by Seleucus IV. Seleucus IV Philopator, which means lover of my father. He sends this Heliodorus to Jerusalem, and Heliodorus actually is trying to raise a whole bunch of taxes, right, in Jerusalem, as a result of basically trying to pay off this war debt that he owes to the Romans. During this time, you also have, just so you guys are aware, a new Ptolemy VI, Philomator, which means lover of my mother, from 180 to 145. Seleucus IV, rather, Philopator, is 187 to 175 BC. And Seleucus IV is murdered. He is assassinated, actually, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Heliodorus dies of a sickness. Now, you actually have, interestingly enough, something very important to the Jewish aspect of the story. You can call them, if you'd like, the liberals and the conservatives for the age. But during this time, you have two groups rising that we do need to talk about for a little bit. You have the Tobiads and the Oneids. The Tobiads being the liberals and the Oneids being the conservatives. The Oneids are actually direct descendants of Aaron. And they're actually led by a priest named Onias, who's actually the high priest, Onias III. And he is actually a high priest of them. That's why, of course, they're called the Oneids. And he's a direct descendant of Aaron. And he actually is fighting for traditional worship, whereas these Tobiads are very much okay with Hellenizing, right? They're very much okay with, as a matter of, and it was actually kind of weird. They would go so far as to reverse circumcise themselves, which was an absolutely horrible torture, very painful process. It was something, they did it on their own accord, don't get me wrong, but the idea was that, of course, you would look less Jewish. They would participate in these different Hellenizing events, want to speak Greek, change their names to Greek, right? The Greek was cool, whereas Judaism was old school and old fashioned. It's very much, the story of liberalism versus conservatism is the same regardless of era. Now, in about, let's just move on to the verse before I go into that. So 11:21, "And in his estate shall stand up a vile person to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and attain the kingdom by flatteries." So what you have here is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and this is our next Epiphanes. He rules from about 175 to 164 BC. The Jews actually called him Epimanes. Epiphanes means God manifest. Epimanes means the madman. So they were not very fond of him, and they played on his self-appointed title. Now, he actually came in place of his brother Demetrius, right? Antiochus IV was not the legitimate heir to the throne here. Actually, it was Demetrius, but Demetrius was being held hostage by the Romans. And so Antiochus IV came to power saying, oh, I'm just going to hold on to this for a little bit for Demetrius, essentially be in his place. And eventually he just kind of decided that he's not down with that and he wants to be the king, right? And of course he thought himself God manifest, so of course he thinks himself to be the king. He literally sold the high priesthood to the highest bidder, who in this particular case happened to be Jason. Now, Jason was actually a Jew, born with a Jewish name, and his Jewish name was actually Joshua. But Jason decided he didn't want to be Jewish, he wanted to be Greek, and so he told Antiochus, hey, I'll build a gymnasium right outside of the temple, the holy temple, and make sure that the taxes are raised and you're getting a lot of money if you allow me to be the high priest. And of course he did. Now, Onias III was actually Jason's brother, I do believe. Which means, at the very least, and this is in 174 when Jason was appointed, about a year after Antiochus starts ruling, which means at the very least it's somewhat legitimate. Ish, right? Not really, of course, because they deposed the true high priest, which was Onias III. And, this selling to the highest bidder is just the first of many, actually, just atrocious things that Antiochus IV will end up doing. Going to 22, and with the armies of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. This is a way of talking about the resistance to Antiochus that he very, very swiftly smashed, much to his credit, actually. And the Prince of the Covenant there is actually Onias. That Onias III, they actually had him killed, which is, of course, very unfortunate. Basically, at this point, what starts happening is that eventually Menelaus, real quick, actually, before I get into that, what you need to understand about the gymnasium is that the gymnasium was not just a place where Greeks did their athletic activity like it is today. The gymnasium, first off, they did all of their work, or all of their play, rather, naked, which of course was highly offensive to the Jewish mind. They were doing this within a stone's throwing distance of the Holy Temple. So that, of course, was also highly offensive to the Jewish mind. But more important and more offensive to the Jewish mind was the pagan practices involved in the gymnasium. The gymnasium and the Olympics and things like that were actually very much religious pagan rituals that the Greeks used. And they would even sacrifice swine to Hercules before they would do these kinds of things. So, of course, this was something that the Greeks, or the Jews rather, especially the Oneid Jews, right, who want to keep the covenant, they are just horribly, horribly offended by this. It ends up getting slightly worse in that the high priesthood is actually sold again. This time to a man by the name of Menelaus, and it's actually at this point that it completely ceases to be legitimate, because Menelaus has no legitimate claim to the throne whatsoever. He's not Aaronic, he's not a Levite, not to the throne, rather to the high priesthood. And so it's just completely and totally illegitimate at this point. This is the moment in history that the priesthood ceases to actually be legitimate. So he does pretty much the exact same way Jason does. He says, I'll Hellenize the city even more than Jason did, and I'll make sure you get even more money. So, that's... I don't know, it's kind of sad, to be honest with you, to see it sold there. But nonetheless, this caused Onias to want to... He just started revolting, starts making a stink about it in so many more eloquent words. And this ends up getting him killed. Moving on to verse number 23. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. And essentially what happens here is after the buying of these Jewish nobles and everything, Antiochus decides that he wants to actually invade the Ptolemaic kingdom. So he ends up sending this force to the Ptolemaic kingdom, and the Ptolemaic kingdom, of course, gets another massive force that it also wants to, that it also builds right in order to try and defend themselves. But they end up losing, and at this point, Ptolemy the Sixth actually ends up becoming sort of a, how do we say, a puppet, right, of Antiochus. And this ends up actually leading him to turn to Rome. And part of the reason this even starts in the first place is because the Oneids turned to the Ptolemaics. But nonetheless, this war that we have here ends up being a rather smashing victory at first. It starts in 170, and at this point, like I said, Ptolemy the Sixth basically becomes a wait a minute, did I skip something? I did. My apologies. I skipped actually a verse here. I skipped verse 23 and 24. So, after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches, yea, he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. And this is what I was actually just talking about, right? Where he buys the Syrian and Jewish nobles, sends a small personal force to Egypt in order to try and basically scout the place, right, before he then sends this massive invasion. Then the verse I just read, which is 25, is when he actually does lead the mass invasion. This is the Sixth Syrian War. Ptolemy the Sixth is betrayed by his advisors, which is why he should. It says that he will have, he will be betrayed, right into the war. I apologize. See, that's a perfect example. I apologize. I just get so tongue-tied on my words sometimes. But as you know, that's why it says, "For they shall forecast devices against him." Some other ways of wording this in other translations are, plot shall be devised against him by those who eat the royal rations. It's basically a way of saying that his advisors betray him, and of course this ends up happening in real life. Ptolemy the Sixth's advisors do indeed betray him, and he becomes this puppet of Antiochus. Antiochus, however, eventually ends up going to, well, actually, first off, in verse number 26, it says, "Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and he and his army rather shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain." Just a way of saying that, right, Ptolemy's army is captured, they fall. It's a very phenomenal victory for Antiochus. And Ptolemy the Eighth actually is wanting to become king in around 168 BC. Because of the fact that Ptolemy the Sixth and Ptolemy the Eighth is illegitimate. You might be wondering what happened to Ptolemy the Seventh. He will show up later. But at this moment, Ptolemy the Eighth is coming in, and he is actually ruling legitimately. Ptolemy the Seventh is a baby at this point. So in 1127, "And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed." So essentially what ends up happening here is Antiochus and his puppet Ptolemy the Sixth start plotting against Ptolemy the Eighth. And they're plotting as if they are allies, but of course their hearts are against each other, right? Now, Ptolemy the Sixth leaves, or Antiochus the Fourth rather leaves Ptolemy the Sixth, as we've said, as the puppet of Egypt, with the exception of Alexandria, and himself actually goes back to Israel, which is what this next verse discusses. 1128, "Then shall he return unto his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land." So Antiochus stops in Jerusalem. He levies a special tax to help pay for his wars against Jerusalem in particular. And he actually ends up then he actually ends up leaving a small force there in Jerusalem when he himself returns to his capital to sort of watch over the place, make sure he's getting his taxes, right? And he actually plunders the Holy Temple while he's there as well. Ptolemy VIII, who's also called Physcon, leads a coup against Ptolemy VI. Then Ptolemy VI goes to Rome, and this is, of course, the point in 168 when he becomes ruler. And 1129 then goes on to say, "At the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the Holy Covenant." I'm reading 29 and 30. "So shall he do, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant." And what ends up happening here is in 168 Ptolemy is reinstated, and Seleucus is going to finish the Sixth Syrian War. He's going to finish what he started, right? Not Seleucus, sorry, Antiochus. However, when he gets there, it's not the same, because Ptolemy is not his puppet anymore. In fact, Ptolemy is backed by Rome. And when Rome decides they are going to come up against him, it's a very small force, actually, that the senator, Publius Laenus, oh my goodness, I cannot speak today, my apologies. Draws a, he draws a literal line in the sand, which is actually where the expression comes from. And the line is actually a circle around Antiochus IV, and he tells Antiochus, if you step out of this circle, you have declared war on Rome. And Antiochus has his entire army behind him, right? They just came here to completely rickroll and rampage over Egypt. And he could take out this force if he wanted to, but he knows that if he does, then the power of Rome is behind them. And again, the Roman destruction of Carthage is still within shouting distance at this point. So this is something that, is very much on their minds as Greeks, right? Now, after this just absolutely horrid embarrassment to himself, Antiochus gets pretty angry. And actually, so Sigmund Freud has this idea called displacement. It's where, say your boss does something that you find absolutely horrible and it infuriates you, but rather than going to, go after your boss, you decide that you're just a rude person and you're going to go kick your cat, right? Well, in this case, Antiochus kicks the cat, and the cat is Jerusalem. So he starts rewarding the Hellenist Jews, right, which is where it says that he pays tribute to those who forsake the Holy Covenant, or the way the King James version actually words it is that he has intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. But nonetheless, the point being that he takes those who are Hellenizing and he actually decides that he is going to reward them with government positions and high-ranking authority. He ends up committing a whole bunch of just horrid atrocities, though, while he is down here. So he changes the name of Yahweh, the Most High God, to Zeus Olympus, as a way of just trying to insult the Jews. He prohibits sacrifice, except for pigs, and not as they are supposed to be done, but to Zeus Olympus, right? He outlaws circumcision, Sabbath worship, and feast days, has orgies and temple prostitution in the temple, plunders the treasury. He tears down houses for the Jews and builds a fort outside of Jerusalem to watch over, and ends up leaving troops behind who continuously going down this path of just horridness, right? And then they start persecuting the Jewish people. You have actually a genocide committed by the Seleucids against the Jewish people, who are deciding that they are going to keep the Holy Covenant, and many thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, are martyred, unfortunately. And it's actually a very sad time. If you ever can, read the book of Maccabees. Now, the book of Maccabees is not inspired scripture. However, it is very good history about this particular time frame. Now, verse 31 goes on to describe a little bit more here of, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate," which is to a certain extent repeating what we've covered now here in 30 after he goes and attacks those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Now on December 25th, Christmas Day actually, 168 BC, they sacrifice a pig on the altar of the Holy Temple. That is sometimes said to be the abomination of desolation. Because we don't really know what the abomination of desolation was. We know Daniel prophesied it, and we know the Maccabees told us about it. But they don't tell us specifically what it is. It could be the sacrificing of the pig. It could be the changing of Yahweh, the Most High God's name, to Zeus Olympus. Or at least, changing, because of course you can't change the Most High God's name. It could be the temple orgy that they had there, right? But nonetheless, it is, well, the majority, I should say, okay, not all of them, but the majority of, what do you call those? Scholars have said that it is the sacrificing of the pig on the altar on December 25th, 168. What is going to, of course, be in the future Christmas Day, and that's a subject we'll get into, of course, at some point here. And then he ends up shutting down the temple, which is why it says he abolishes the right to burn offerings, and that is shut down for about 3 years, roughly, 168 to 165-ish. Really, it's 164 BC. And the dedication of the temple on, I think, December 12th, if I'm not mistaken. But nonetheless, that's where the 8 days of Hanukkah actually come from, is the rededication of the temple in 164. Verse number 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Right, so you have the Judeo-Hellenists, or the Proto-Sadducees, who are embracing paganism. They are embracing Greek culture. They are embracing Greek language, Greek literature, Greek myths, Greek legends. They are very much infatuated with the Greek people, and because of that, the Maccabean revolt that is soon to come is actually very much a civil war as much as it is a revolution. And then the other group you have here is the Hasidim, which means the pious ones, right? And these are the Proto-Pharisees. Now, surprisingly enough, despite how evil the Pharisees end up being, at this time they were actually very good people. And actually, the book of Daniel, in this very prophecy, as we'll see here in a moment, prophesizes their fall. But at first, these Proto-Pharisees were actually the ones who were heroically standing up to the Judeo-Hellenists and to these Hasidim, as they were called at this time, not really Proto-Pharisees, but they eventually evolved into the Pharisees. These Hasidim were standing up, being martyred for defense of their faith. They started leading an underground resistance, much like the Polish or Czech or French underground resistances of World War II. And again, thousands, hundreds of thousands of them were martyred for their beliefs in the one true God and the Holy Covenant, and in trying to keep that Holy Covenant. And it's actually, it is interesting, to be honest with you, because it just goes to show that earthly organizations can be easily corrupted. Not that that is the point we're trying to make here, but I would just like to briefly say, and we will talk about this in a later show, when Catholics claim that Peter was the first leader of the Church of Rome, he very well might have been. I don't know where he was, or whether he was, or whether he wasn't. However, as we can see, by the example of the Pharisees, by the example of the priesthood in general, right? Because the priesthood ends up becoming very corrupt by the time Jesus is actually on the earth. And Jesus himself, right? Because we believe Jesus is God. So Jesus himself is the one who set up that priesthood in the first place, right? But humans corrupt things. Which is just a way of saying Peter may have been the first bishop of Rome, but he certainly was not the first pope, right? And that kind of thing doesn't mean anything, because when men get their own ideologies into an organization, that organization can become very, very corrupt. And tens of thousands were martyred in defense of the faith. They eventually became the Pharisees and became so corrupt in their own hearts that they murdered our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So what does that tell you? It tells you that what you started as means nothing if you do not continue on that path. Anyways, moving on. Verse number 33. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, and by captivity, and by spoil many days. And so this is where it talks about how the faithful continue to lead the Jews, right? And they have this underground resistance. Many competent Jewish scholars lead underground services in synagogues on Shabbat and on the feast days to ensure that everybody is able to worship properly, to follow the law, to love their God, which is really all that these people want to do. And because of this, the Maccabean revolt following actually ends up being the really the first ideological war that we know of. To a certain extent, you can make the argument that Joshua's conquests were, but Joshua's conquests were admittedly meant to actually get land, right? While the people themselves were a holy people and it was a holy God-ordained conquest, the war wasn't necessarily... I mean, to a certain extent it was, right? It was a judgment against the Canaanites. But this is the first war we really see where people are rallying around an ideology and fighting for the ideology because the ideology is being oppressed or put down or not implemented in some way, shape, or form, right? This is the first of many brilliant and fantastic campaigns from great people like the Patriots, right, of the United States Revolution. It's also the start of some of the more horrid campaigns, like the French Revolution, right? It's just but it's the first really ideological conflict. And actually, getting on to that, because verse 34, now when they shall fall, they shall be helping with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. Now, many people think that this little help is in reference to the Maccabean revolt. I personally think the Maccabean revolt is already going on at this point. And the reason I say that is because if we go back to verse number 32 here, it says, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Now, it already makes clear in the next verse, in verse number 33, that these people will be martyred, right? And we know in Jerusalem, and in the city, and all around Israel, people were being martyred for their faith, right? However, when it says they shall be strong and have exploits, right, to me that seems to imply that they're already fighting. And when you look at the leaders of the Maccabean revolt, they definitely seem to be Hasidim, right? A lot of people have compared Judah Maccabee to more terroristic fighters like Muhammad, or like like Uthman, or Osama bin Laden, somebody like that, the Crusades, right? I don't personally buy that. I don't even buy that he's somebody like a Simon Bar Kokhba, who would revolt against the Romans in about 132 AD, rather, claiming to be the Messiah. And to the best of my knowledge, it doesn't look like Judah Maccabee ever claimed to be the Messiah. It also doesn't look like Judah Maccabee, in my opinion, nor his father Mattathias, who started this revolt. It doesn't seem to me that they ever went away from the faith, right? Now, Jonathan Maccabee, the brother of Judah, does. But that isn't something... Well, and let me just get to the whole history of this, just to put this in perspective for you guys. So basically, some Romans come to a Jewish town, and the priest there, Mattathias, is ordered to sacrifice a pig on an altar. He's like 80 years old, by the way, when this happens. And he, of course, refuses. He says no. To which the Romans reply that they will actually take someone else. And when one of the Jews walks up to actually, not agree, but to basically listen to these Romans, right, to do what it is that they're saying to do, sacrifice this pig to Zeus, Mattathias just freaks out, right? He freaks out that he is just watching this Jew before his very eyes, this Jew in his own town, right, where he's supposed to be the priest of the town, and this Jew is going to sacrifice to a false god. So he, in a fit of what can only be described as really supernatural rage for an 80-year-old man, he actually ends up killing a few of the guards and the man who was going to do the sacrifice, starting quite a large revolt in the town that eventually ends in victory for the townspeople, and then flying, or not flying, my apologies, excuse me, fleeing into the Judean mountains, right, where he hangs out, and he then, this is all 167 BC, and he then, right, roughly a year after this is all started, and he then actually decrees Judah Maccabee, his son, as his general, right? And now when Mattathias actually ends up dying, I'm not entirely sure. You can definitely look that up here, though, so just assume a moment. Oh, excuse me. But nonetheless, while I'm doing that, this Judah Maccabee, right? Now, Maccabee was not his last name. Maccabee is a title. It actually means hammer. To the way that it actually would be said would be Yehuda HaMaccabi, right? Which means Judah the hammer. And it just goes to show you how brilliant his tactics were and how fantastic of a general he actually was. He was son of the priest Mattathias, of course, like I was just saying here. I guess it doesn't actually say when. Yeah, he died 165 BC. Mattathias did. But Judah, in 167, ends up leading these groups, and he has a very small guerrilla force, and he leads smashing victory after smashing victory against the Seleucids. Now, during the time that he is winning these victories, there is still a whole lot of persecution, and it's getting worse and it's getting worse. And this is why I think that it says after verse 32, after it says that they are strong and have exploits, why it says in verse 33 that there are still people who are suffering captivity, falling to the sword and flame, and suffering plunder. It's because that is actually happening right in the cities. It's only in the rural areas that Judah Maccabee is actually fighting, and he's only doing so with a small force as well. When verse 34 says that ye shall receive a little help and many will join them by flatteries, I think personally that is talking about after Judah has already had some successes. And of course, I'm not the end-all be-all on this. So when people say that Judah Maccabee and the Maccabean Revolt itself is the little help, that very well could be. The reason I think that it's, because basically what ends up happening is after, Judah starts winning these victories, a whole lot of people actually flock to him, right? And they start following him as their military and political commander. And Judah actually, lost my train of thought. Judah actually does accept them. However, the vast majority of them are not legitimate followers of the faith. And we even end up seeing that after Judah dies in the Hasmonean dynasty. They're very anti-Jewish faith, actually. As a matter of fact, Jesus, as we see in, I believe it's the book of Matthew, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't have the verse down, Jesus actually talks about how a lot of the oral laws that the priesthood was talking about by his time, and keep in mind the Hasmonean dynasty separates the Maccabean Revolt in his time, they were just making up laws. There was just men here making up laws and pretending that they were holy and just as valuable as the scriptures, right? And but to the best of my knowledge, this does not happen until after Judah dies. And in another defense of Judah, a lot of people have said that, like I said, they tried to compare Judah to some of these more terroristic types of leaders, and admittedly Judah did some things I don't think he should have done. He forcefully converted people, which is the main thing that I don't think he should have done. Even Joshua didn't forcefully convert people, you know what I mean? Nobody in the Bible forcefully. They did say, if you want to be part of us here if you want to be with us in this land, in our land, you do need to convert. But that still does give you the ability to leave, whereas admittedly the Maccabees did actually not allow them the ability to leave peacefully. They just told them you will convert, and even sometimes had forced circumcisions, which I'm sure you can imagine how terrible that was. And while I will definitely admit that the Maccabees did a lot of wrong things, I will also say that I don't think there is any evidence Judah Maccabee himself perpetrated these, but rather the ones after him. Nor do I think the things that we can prove Judah Maccabee did are negative, right? The Bible very much speaks of Phineas, who is a good comparison to Judah Maccabee, the Kanai, right, which is the Hebrew rendering of the word zealous. He actually talks about him in very positive light, right? Somebody who's willing to go and fight and die for the faith, that does always look at in very positive lights, and there's a reason for that. And of course, it definitely depends on your motives, right? If you're going out and senselessly conquering, right? As an example, if Joshua or Judah Maccabee were to go conquer the Syrians and subjugate them and tell them they need to be Jewish, that would be wrong, right? But what both Joshua and Judah Maccabee and Phinehas and all these other zealous military commanders throughout Jewish history were doing is they were reestablishing the covenant in their own house, right? And I don't find anything wrong with that. I would say the same thing for anyone, for that matter. If the Sikhs want a theocracy of Khalistan, let them have it. If the Saudis want to have Islamic law, let them have it. It's their land, and in your house, you should be allowed to have the laws that you choose to have, especially considering that you signed a holy covenant with God, the Most High God, right? And I want to specify that. I mean, so what I think Judah Maccabee is a hero personally. I don't find him to be overly zealous. I don't find him to be somebody who is... Now, I do think he did some wrong things, or at least the Maccabeans, like I said, did some wrong things, because I don't think there's any evidence Judah himself did that. And again, I could be wrong. But I think the little help that they're talking about is the many who join Judah insincerely, not Judah and the Maccabees themselves. And I think that's actually why it says directly after they receive a little help that they do, have many join them with the flatteries here. And many of these people are just joining, of course, just to win. They want to be on the winning side. Now, in 164 BC, Judah actually rededicates the temple of the Holy Temple, right? And it is this that is actually being celebrated in Hanukkah. According to the story, which I am certainly not willing to deny, there was barely any olive oil they had, but they lit it, and it actually ended up miraculously staying lit for 8 days. Right, a single day's worth lasted 8 days. And thus is the miracle of Hanukkah, and they celebrate the rededication of the temple every year now as a result of that. Now, it is interesting that actually the book of the Maccabees is not in the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament, 39 books of the Old Testament, but it is in the Catholic Bible. Now, the Christian Bible, and yes, I do specify between Catholic and Christian, because I am sorry if you are going to specify between Islamic and Christian and Mormon and Christian, which I certainly will, because they are different, then you need to specify between Catholic and Christian, because Catholics believe a whole lot of really whacked stuff that Christians do not believe, okay? But nonetheless, it is interesting the Catholics actually do have that in their Bible, and the Jews don't. The Protestant Bible is, of course, based off of the Jewish Bible, at least in regards to the Old Testament, which is why we don't either. But yeah, just interesting there for you, and it's in the 1st through 4th books of Maccabees that I'm talking about, by the way, in case you were wondering. Now, that doesn't mean that Hanukkah is a non-legitimate holiday. Jesus himself actually makes reference to Hanukkah. But nonetheless, it is just a little interesting note. I personally think it's because the Tanakh was already finished. There are those who will say that this is incorrect and that this cannot be correct because Daniel was written around the same time as the Maccabees. However, that is patently false. That is just patently false. And the reason I decided to bring that up, even though we're not talking... sorry about that. Even though we're not talking directly about biblical authorship, and we will do shows on that at a later time, the reason I do want to stress that is because there's a lot of people who will tell you the reason why this prophecy is so spectacular, so phenomenally accurate in its politics, in its details of war, in the rise of Greece and the kings that are after Persia, is because it was actually written after the fact, and that Daniel, in fact, did not write this. Again, this is patently false. We know for a fact that by at least 150 BC, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, and we know for a fact that by at least 300 BC, the Septuagint was written. Okay? And the fact that we know these things means that we know for a fact that by at least 150 BC... Now, granted, 150 is after the Maccabean Revolt, but there are correct predictive prophecies that go farther than 150 BC. And on top of that, we have the Septuagint, which also has the book of Daniel in it, and that was 300 BC. So, I'm sorry, that's just wrong. It's just patently false to say that Daniel was written by somebody who was not Daniel at a later time. Nonetheless, back to the original point, the reason I think the Maccabees was not actually there is because of the fact that the Tanakh was already finished at this point. And I think we can prove that by the fact that the Septuagint is finished at this point. Right, it's finished by 300 BC. This all happened by 167 BC. And while it may even be something spectacular, right, and of course it's something God ordained, because God even has one of his prophets speak of it, right? God delivers this prophecy to Daniel and has Daniel write it down for us, so clearly it's something that is important and ordained of God. However, you don't just add books into the Bible, right? If the Tanakh is finished, then the Tanakh is finished. And according to the best scholarly interpretation, 420 BC, roughly, right, circa 420 BC, is when Malachi was around. He wrote the very last book, and right around that time is the time when the Tanakh is finished, according to the word of the Lord. So that's all I have to say about it, right? I have no quarrels with the Lord trying to, not trying to, but successfully keeping books he does not want in his Bible out of his Bible. Now, after 164 BC, when Judah actually does end up rededicating Jerusalem after he's retaken Jerusalem, he continues fighting until about 160 BC. By the time he is killed, because he's actually killed in battle, but by the time he is killed, he has firmly established Jewish independent rule, but there is nobody really leading. He was kind of the leader, but he was, de facto leader. It wasn't official. And it's not until Jonathan Maccabee, so Jonathan Maccabee, first off, is his brother and replacement, but it's not until 20 years after he dies that Jonathan Maccabee actually declares himself king. And Jonathan Maccabee actually not only declares himself king, but also declares himself high priest, which you're not supposed to do according to Jewish law. You don't mix high priest and king. Only the Mashiach, or Messiah in English, is actually allowed to do that. And of course that is YESHUA HAMASHIACH, which, by the way, is another reason why I think Judah Maccabee was a firm defender of the covenant. Why I think Judah Maccabee was a great man who was fighting in the name of the Most High God, because he didn't do that. You notice he very easily could have established himself as high priest. He did not. He very easily could have established himself as king of Israel. He did not. Jonathan Maccabee, the brother of Judah, is the one who establishes himself as both high priest and king, and establishes the Hasmonean dynasty that ends up corrupting the Pharisees, who started off as the Hasidim, right, who started off as people who were very much in line with the Word of God, who were even dying for the Word of God, right? And it's this Hasmonean dynasty that capitulates to Roman rule. It's this Hasmonean dynasty that illegitimizes the priesthood. It's this Hasmonean dynasty that mixes the priesthood with the kingship, claiming themselves to be Mashiach, when of course YESHUA HAMASHIACH is the real Mashiach. Blessed be the name of him. Now, it's just, I don't know, to me that is such a huge indicator that Judah himself was actually a firm defender of the faith. Because whilst others may have come after him and claimed that he was Mashiach, he never did. The only Maccabean who did was Jonathan, and Jonathan, even though he doesn't do it expressly, does it by mixing the priesthood with the kingship. He himself never did. And if you want to make the argument that other people did, therefore he must be evil, well, other people also claimed that John the Baptist was Mashiach. And we of course know John the Baptist was a good person, right? Some people have definitely claimed it for themselves, right? And those people, like the Ptolemaic or the Messianic revolts against Ptolemy, right? Those people definitely claimed it for themselves, and they were wrong. And they failed as a result of that. And that's another thing I want to point out too. To me, it seems very clear that God was with Judah, because he won smashing victory after smashing victory after smashing victory. He rededicated the temple. He has a miracle associated with his rededication of the temple. He won the war, established independent Jewish home rule. Whereas all these other ones who actually did engage in acts of religious terrorism, and who actually did claim Mashiach upon themselves, like Simon Bar Kokhba, like the Ptolemaic revolts, they failed. They failed, and they have no everlasting holiday to, to follow up their successes. And of course, they don't have the successes because they failed both in battle and in campaign. They end up not having any miracles associated with them either, which I think is another thing that shows very clear indication that Judah Maccabee and his followers had God with them, right? And I know I'm definitely in the minority in this, don't get me wrong. And even a majority of even fundamentalist Christians and Orthodox Jews have made the claim that Judah Maccabee was a zealot and a terrorist. I don't believe that, though. I think Judah Maccabee was a man fighting for the liberation of his people, fighting for the reestablishment of the Holy Covenant, and I think that is very much affirmed in what actually happens in his career, in his smashing victories, in the dedication of the temple, his ability to rededicate the temple, him never claiming Mashiach for himself, him never claiming high priest for himself, him never claiming king for himself, and the miracle associated with his rededication. I think all of it speaks to Judah Maccabee definitely being a firm and devout believer in God, and I personally believe I will be meeting him in heaven. And again, like I said, I understand that even amongst people who agree with me on the fundamentals of Christianity and Judaism and all that other things, I say Christianity and Judaism because we agree a lot on a lot of stuff, but nonetheless, and I do understand that these people disagree with me, and I understand why they disagree with me, and I may be wrong. However, I firmly believe that, like I said, that Judah Maccabee was just an incredible character, an absolutely incredible character. Now on to some of the next verses here, right? Because we're almost done, actually. Just pull up my Bible real quick. All right. So verse 35, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. The time appointed is the time of the Messiah. When it says, and some of them of understanding shall fall, and it says to try them and to purge them and to make them white, right? So it is a cleansing effect, and this does have a mass cleansing effect on the people of Israel. It's part of the reason why the people of Israel were so prepared for Mashiach when he arrived. Part of the reason why they actually thought John the Baptist was Mashiach rather than Yeshua. And of course, John says, no, it is not me, it is one who comes after me, whose shoes I am not even worthy to untie. Of course, he says it in the term of sandals, because they don't wear tennis shoes like we do. And so, basically, in my opinion, and again, I am in the minority here, but in my opinion, this is talking specifically about the death of Judah Maccabee and people like him, right? Judah Maccabee himself died in 160, but by the time we get to 140 BC and the Hasmonean dynasty has been appointed, all these men are martyred, right? And those men who are not martyred, who are still in control at least, because you still have a lot of followers of the covenant who are, lay people, most definitely. But as far as the people who are actually in command at this point, like I said, you do not mix high priest and the kingship. That is a job only for YESHUA HAMASHIACH. And Jonathan Maccabee decided that he was going to do that. And, you have numerous problems with what ends up coming after the Hasmonean dynasty, and I think that is partially because of what this verse is describing here. Moving on to verse 36. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the... I'm actually going to read the full rest of the chapter, and I'll explain why in a minute. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor, with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Now, the reason I read all that is because there is some debate as to verse 36 to 35. When it says, and the king, it is assumed by half, roughly, of the people who read this, that the king that is being spoken of is the king of the king of the north, rather. I'm about to say king of the south. And one of the things that they use to indicate this is that first off it says the king, and that would be chronologically correct. And second off it says he shall enter into the glorious land, which of course we know he had done. And third, fourth, my apologies. It also says, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. Now this has been used by a lot of people to say that it's not, because it seems to indicate that this king is being attacked by the king of the south. And some have even indicated that the king of the north is joining this king of the south to attack. Right? Now, I am not going to give you guys an interpretation on verses 36 to 45 because the jury is out, in my opinion. This very well could be a verse that is talking about the future, that is talking about an appointed Antichrist, right? This very much could be a verse that is discussing latter events after the Maccabean revolt. I personally choose not to actually make any claim on it because I don't personally know, and I'm not going to teach on something that I don't feel confident in. I don't feel confident that God has revealed that to me at this current point. So that's just my interpretation of it. Nonetheless, I don't want anyone to use that as a reason to negate verses 1 through 35, right? Because you see this kind of thing happen a lot, where you have a 99% accuracy, right? And the 1% you can't prove accurate. It's not that it's inaccurate, it's that you can't verifiably prove at this time that it's accurate. Now, in my opinion, the logical thinker will look at the 99% and say, I cannot find this 1%, but 99% has been true, therefore I think this 1% will be true. And we see that plenty of time, actually, with the biblical scholars saying Ur didn't exist. We have found two cities claiming to be Ur, right? We have Ur in Iraq and Urfa in Turkey. They said that with the Hittites. They said that with Imhotep. They said that with the Assyrians in the city of Nineveh. They said that with the city of Troy, right? They always say, no, these people can't possibly exist, even though these sources are true and historical. In this case, it's not only true and historical, but prophetic, right? And I think it is very clearly indicated here that, or not very clearly indicated, but it should be very clearly indicated that this is true, right? The level of prophetic insight. Keep in mind that we have the Septuagint. We know for a fact that Daniel was written before most of this came to pass. Okay, most of this came to pass well after 300, and the Septuagint was written sometime around 300 BC. Here we have just an absolutely immense amount of prophetic detail delivered. We can prove verifiably that it happens in the future. And that one little point, that verse 36 through 45, is correct. And that was the point I'm trying to make. Right. Just because we don't have the set interpretation for that does not mean it is not correct. And if you are looking at the rest of the verse, you cannot deny that this is completely uncanny. So in my opinion, you have two choices. You can either be the highly inconsistent secularist and say that this was written sometime around 164 BC, even though we had the Septuagint, and it was written sometime around 300 BC, and that this person had such immense details of things happening hundreds and hundreds of years, specifically 150 years. Well, actually, it depends. It's 150 some odd years if you take Alexander, but it's like 200 and some odd years. Let's see, what is it? No, specifically 316 years from Thermopylae to 164 BC. You know what I mean? So it just seems to me that if you're going to take that opinion, well, I mean, I'm sorry, I am kind of getting jumbled up in my thoughts here. The point I am actually trying to say here is that you can take the highly inconsistent secularist opinion, which is that prophetic prophecy is impossible. This must have been written in 164 BC, and this person must have had immense and detailed knowledge of the last 316 years. By the way, more detailed knowledge apparently than his own time, because the claim, according to these people, is that it must be 164 BC because 36 through 45 didn't happen. And again, where I'm at with it is you can also take the second position, the consistent position, which is clearly verses 2 through 35 are accurate. Clearly, I say 2 through 35 just because that's when the prophecy starts. The first verse, of course, is just telling you the year that it happens, this prophecy happens. But we'll just say verses 1 through 35 are accurate. If verses 1 through 35 are accurate in prophetic prophecy, and that can be proven with the existence of the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, then it necessitates 36 and 45 also being accurate. And because we do not have the interpretation down and set in stone, and I say that because we may have it, there's multiple interpretations, it's just we haven't agreed on it yet, right? That doesn't mean that we disregard this, because clearly it is shown that these are things that could not have possibly been known by these people, regardless of the opinion you take. Even if you do think he was somebody in 164, why does this person have more knowledge about 480 than his own life? Doesn't make any sense. Right, and of course I wouldn't make the opinion that 36 through 45 is wrong, so I'm not saying he knew less about his own time period. However, that is the argument that people who make late dating claims are giving us, right? And that doesn't make any sense. Likewise, if he is not a prophet of God, he is in 538 BC giving this, I mean, what, did he get lucky? You know what I mean? He just happens to be completely and utterly lucky in getting 2 consecutive now, because we have Daniel 2 and Daniel 11 prophecies absolutely phenomenally detailed. I don't buy that, but you can go ahead and buy that if you like. This has been all that I'm going to get into today. We'll have some links in the description for you and some other goodies. Mainly it'll be this chapter and also a link to 2 videos by Bruce Gore, because that's where I got the majority of my notes for this particular discussion. We'll have a few other places where we got notes as well. I also want to say our next one here, our next video, is actually going to be on, I believe, Daniel 7. I haven't decided if it's going to be 7 or 8 yet, but I think we're going to go 7, then 8, then 9, and then we'll go into Daniel 12 as well. We might even be able to do 7, 8, and 9 all together, because I do believe both 7 and 8, if I'm not mistaken, are actually repeat prophecies that add a little bit more detail to the 2 prophecies we've already covered, which are 11 and 2. So we will be getting into that real soon here. Go ahead and like and share if you actually like our content here. If you do not like our content, definitely let us know why. leave any questions, comments, concerns in the comment section below, and go ahead and check out those real cool things in the description there. There'll be a link to our Facebook page, excuse me, as well as to these other videos I was talking about. And also, we do, if you like this content, very much appreciate any subscriptions to the page. Any support that you give us, we definitely do appreciate, and thank you for it. I would like to end with a prayer real quick. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to study your amazing and profound prophetic words, Lord. I pray that you give us revelation, that we may understand your word and your will, Lord. That you bless everybody who may be watching this video and touch their hearts, Lord, with the absolutely amazing magnitude of your scriptures. In Jesus Christ's holy name I pray. Amen. Alrighty. Thank you guys for watching. Again, like, share, subscribe if this is something you are interested in. Questions and comments below, and check the links in the description. Shalom, and you have a phenomenal evening.